Officer Jake Martinez had been patrolling the quiet suburbs of Millbrook for 8 years, but nothing could have prepared him for the call that came through his radio on that foggy October morning. The dispatcher's voice crackled with urgency as she relayed information about a missing child report from Cedar Lane, a street lined with modest homes where families had lived peacefully for decades. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick fog that had settled over the neighborhood like a gray blanket. Jake pulled his patrol car up to 1247 Cedar Lane, where a small crowd had already gathered on the front lawn. He could see the worry etched on their faces even before he stepped out of his vehicle. His German Shepherd partner, Rex, sat alert in the back seat, sensing the tension in the air. Sarah Coleman rushed toward the officer the moment she saw his uniform. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her hands shook as she tried to speak. She was a single mother of twin girls, both 7 years old, and one of them had vanished during the night. The missing child was Emma, who had been sleeping in the same bedroom as her identical twin sister Lily, just hours before. Sarah explained through her tears that she had checked on the girls around midnight, as she always did before going to bed. Both Emma and Lily were fast asleep in their twin beds, covered by their favorite Disney princess blankets. The bedroom window had been closed and locked, just as Sarah had left it every night for the past 7 years. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, and no indication that anyone had come into the house during the night. When Sarah went to wake the girls for breakfast at 7 in the morning, she found only Lily in the room. Emma's bed was empty, her blanket thrown back as if she had simply gotten up and walked away. But Emma was not anywhere in the house. Sarah had searched every room, every closet, under every bed, and even in the basement storage area. The little girl had simply vanished without a trace. Lily sat quietly on the front porch steps, clutching her stuffed rabbit and staring at the ground. She had not spoken a word since her mother discovered Emma was missing. The 7-year-old seemed to be in a state of shock, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to her twin sister. Neighbors had offered to help search, but Sarah was afraid to let Lily out of her sight, terrified that she might lose her remaining daughter too. Officer Martinez knelt down beside Lily, speaking in the gentle tone he had learned to use with children during his years of service. He asked her simple questions about the night before, whether she had heard any sounds or seen anyone in their room. But Lily only shook her head and held her rabbit tighter. Her silence was more troubling than any scream could have been. The neighborhood was typical of suburban America, with well-maintained lawns and children's bicycles left casually in driveways. Most residents knew each other by name and watched out for one another's children. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their kids play outside until dark, and where missing children were unthinkable. The fact that Emma had disappeared from her own bedroom, with her twin sister sleeping just 3 feet away, defied all logic and reason. Rex began to show signs of agitation as Jake interviewed the family. The trained police dog was picking up scents and sounds that humans could not detect. His ears were perked forward, and he kept looking toward the wooded area behind the Coleman house. The forest stretched for several miles, connecting to a state park that thousands of people visited each year. If Emma had somehow wandered into those woods during the night, finding her would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Jake called for backup and requested a search and rescue team to be dispatched immediately. He also asked for additional K-9 units to assist Rex in tracking Emma's scent. Time was crucial in missing child cases, especially when the weather was cold and the child was only 7 years old. Emma had been wearing pink pajamas and bare feet when she disappeared, offering little protection against the October chill. As more officers arrived on scene, Jake began organizing a systematic search of the immediate area. Neighbors volunteered to help, forming small groups to check their own properties and any places where a small child might hide or seek shelter. The local fire department arrived with their emergency response vehicle, bringing additional equipment and manpower to aid in the search efforts. Sarah provided Jake with a recent photograph of Emma, taken just 2 weeks earlier at the twins' school picture day. Emma had been smiling brightly in the photo, her blonde hair pulled back in pigtails and her blue eyes sparkling with joy. She was missing her 2 front teeth, having lost them just the week before, and the gap in her smile made her look even younger than her 7 years. The photograph would be essential for the search teams and for issuing an Amber Alert if necessary. Jake studied Emma's face carefully, memorizing every detail that might help him recognize her if they encountered her during the search. He had worked on missing child cases before, but something about this situation felt different. The complete absence of any evidence or explanation made it unlike anything he had experienced in his career. Rex continued to pace restlessly near the back door of the Coleman house, his nose working overtime to process the various scents in the area. Jake trusted his partner's instincts completely, knowing that the dog's sense of smell was thousands of times more sensitive than any human's. If Rex was detecting something important, Jake needed to pay attention and follow his lead. As the morning progressed, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the dense forest that loomed behind the quiet suburban neighborhood. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward the gray sky and creating shadows that seemed to move and shift in the changing light. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, a 7-year-old girl might be wandering alone, cold and frightened, calling for her mother and sister. Jake knew that every minute counted in cases like this. Children could not survive long in the wilderness without proper clothing, food, and shelter. Emma had been missing for at least 7 hours, possibly longer if she had left her bed earlier in the night. The temperature had dropped to near freezing during the overnight hours, and hypothermia was a real and immediate danger. The search for Emma Coleman was about to begin in earnest, and Officer Jake Martinez could only hope that they would find her alive and unharmed. As he prepared to enter the woods with Rex, he had no idea that what they would discover would challenge everything. He thought he knew about missing children cases and leave him with memories that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Rex's nose hit the ground the moment Jake unclipped his leash at the edge of the forest. The German Shepherd moved with purpose, weaving between the trees and following a scent trail that was invisible to human senses. Jake followed closely behind, his radio crackling with updates from other search teams who were combing different sections of the neighborhood and surrounding areas. The forest floor was covered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves that crunched softly under their feet. Ancient oak and maple trees created a canopy overhead that filtered the weak morning sunlight into scattered patches of gold and amber. It was beautiful and peaceful under normal circumstances, but today the woods felt ominous and threatening, as if they were hiding secrets that no one was meant to discover. Rex suddenly stopped and lifted his head, his ears rotating like radar dishes as he processed sounds that Jake could not hear. The dog's body language indicated he had detected something significant, and Jake felt his heart rate increase as he prepared for whatever they might find. Rex began moving again, but this time with more urgency, pulling Jake deeper into the forest along a narrow deer path that wound between massive tree trunks. They had been searching for nearly 2 hours when Rex led Jake to a small clearing where a creek ran through the woods. The water was shallow and clear, flowing gently over smooth stones and fallen branches. Jake could see his own reflection in the surface as he knelt beside the stream to examine the muddy bank for any signs that Emma might have passed this way. There, pressed into the soft earth near the water's edge, was a small footprint. Jake's pulse quickened as he studied the impression, noting its size and shape. It appeared to be from a bare foot, roughly the size that would belong to a 7-year-old child. The print was clear and well-defined, suggesting it had been made recently, possibly during the night when the ground was still soft from the heavy fog. Jake immediately called for the other search teams to converge on his location, while Rex continued to work the scent trail. The dog had moved upstream, following the creek bank and occasionally stopping to investigate specific spots where the scent seemed stronger. Jake documented the footprint with his phone camera and marked the location with bright orange surveyor's tape so the evidence could be properly processed later. More footprints became visible as Jake followed Rex along the creek. Some were partial impressions in the mud, while others were complete prints that showed the desperate path a small child had taken through the wilderness during the cold, dark hours before dawn. The prints told a story of confusion and fear, sometimes doubling back on themselves as if Emma had become lost and disoriented in the darkness. Detective Lisa Park arrived at the creek with additional K-9 units and forensic specialists who could properly document and preserve the evidence they had found. Lisa had 15 years of experience with missing persons cases and had worked on several child abduction investigations. She immediately recognized the significance of the footprint trail and began organizing a more focused search effort based on the direction Emma appeared to have traveled. The creek wound through the forest for several miles before eventually connecting to the state park's main trail system. If Emma had continued following the water, she could have traveled a considerable distance during the night. The thought of a barefoot 7-year-old navigating rough terrain in complete darkness was heartbreaking, but it also gave the search teams hope that she might still be alive and moving under her own power. Rex and the other police dogs were working with incredible intensity, their training and natural instincts driving them to follow every trace of Emma's scent through the forest. The dogs were able to distinguish her specific scent from the countless other smells in the woods, including wildlife, other humans who had passed through the area, and the natural odors of decomposing leaves and forest vegetation. Jake noticed that Rex seemed to be growing more agitated as they continued upstream. The dog's behavior suggested that the scent was getting stronger, which could mean they were getting closer to finding Emma. But Jake also knew that Rex's agitation could indicate something more troubling. In his years of working with the dog, Jake had learned to read his partner's subtle signals and emotional responses to different situations. They had followed the creek for nearly a mile when Rex suddenly stopped and began whining softly. The dog's ears were pinned back against his head, and his tail was tucked low between his legs. This was not the excited behavior of a dog who had found what he was searching for, but rather the concerned response of an animal who sensed something was wrong. Detective Park caught up to Jake and Rex at that moment, bringing with her 2 additional officers and another search dog. She immediately noticed Rex's change in demeanor and asked Jake what his partner was indicating. Jake explained that Rex seemed to be picking up Emma's scent more strongly in this area, but the dog's body language suggested anxiety rather than the excitement they would expect if Emma were nearby and safe. The group spread out to search the immediate area more thoroughly, looking for any signs of the missing girl or clues about what might have happened to her. The creek curved sharply to the right at this point, creating a small pool where the water collected before continuing downstream. The banks were steeper here, and Jake could see where someone might have had difficulty climbing up from the water. Rex led them around the bend in the creek to where an enormous fallen tree had created a natural bridge across the water. The massive oak had been toppled by a storm years earlier, and its trunk now lay horizontally about 4 feet above the creek surface. Jake could see scuff marks on the bark where someone had recently climbed across, and there were more small footprints in the mud on both sides of the makeshift bridge. Detective Park examined the scene carefully, noting that Emma appeared to have successfully crossed the creek using the fallen tree. This showed remarkable determination and resourcefulness for a 7-year-old child, but it also meant she had continued moving deeper into the forest during the night. The farther Emma had traveled from her home, the more difficult it would be to find her, and the greater the danger she faced from exposure and exhaustion. The search teams regrouped and prepared to continue following Emma's trail deeper into the wilderness. Additional resources were being called in, including helicopter support and thermal imaging equipment that could detect body heat from above the forest canopy. The state park rangers were also joining the search effort, bringing their detailed knowledge of the terrain and any hazards that might pose a threat to a small child. Jake looked at his watch and realized that Emma had been missing for over 10 hours. The temperature was beginning to drop as afternoon gave way to evening, and the thought of the little girl spending another night alone in the forest was almost unbearable. Rex seemed to sense his partner's urgency and began moving with renewed purpose, following the scent trail that would lead them deeper into the heart of the wilderness. As they prepared to continue their search, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Emma Coleman was somewhere in these vast woods, alone and frightened, and every minute that passed reduced their chances of finding her alive. The footprints they had discovered gave them hope that she was still moving and still alive, but Jake knew that a 7-year-old could not survive much longer in these conditions without help. The search had been going on for 12 hours when the first helicopter arrived overhead, its rotors cutting through the evening air with a steady thump that echoed through the forest. Jake looked up through the canopy of trees as the aircraft began making systematic passes over the area, equipped with thermal imaging cameras that could detect the heat signature of a small human body, even in dense woodland. Rex had led them nearly 3 miles from the Coleman house, following Emma's scent trail through increasingly difficult terrain. The dog's dedication was remarkable, never losing focus despite the physical demands of navigating fallen logs, steep ravines, and thick underbrush. Jake's respect for his four-legged partner had grown even deeper during this search, watching Rex work with a determination that seemed almost human in its intensity. The trail had taken them through a section of the forest where old-growth trees created a cathedral-like atmosphere, their massive trunks rising like columns toward the darkening sky. The forest floor here was relatively clear of undergrowth, covered instead with a soft carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves that muffled their footsteps. It was in this peaceful setting that Rex suddenly stopped and began behaving in a way Jake had never seen before. The German shepherd sat down abruptly and tilted his head back, releasing a long, mournful howl that sent chills down Jake's spine. It was not the excited bark of a dog who had found his target, nor was it the frustrated whine of a dog who had lost the scent. This was something entirely different, a sound that seemed to express grief or distress in a way that was almost human in its emotional depth. Detective Park and the other searchers quickly gathered around Jake and Rex, all of them disturbed by the dog's unusual behavior. Rex had never howled like this during a search operation, and his body language suggested he was experiencing some kind of emotional distress. The dog's ears were flattened against his head, and he kept looking up at Jake with an expression that seemed to plead for understanding. Jake knelt beside his partner and spoke to him in the calming voice he always used during training sessions. Rex responded by nuzzling against Jake's chest and then walking a few steps forward before stopping again. The dog seemed to be trying to communicate something important, but he was clearly struggling with whatever he was sensing in this location. The search team spread out to examine the area more carefully, looking for any signs of Emma or clues about what might have caused Rex's strange reaction. The ground here showed evidence of recent disturbance, with leaves and forest debris scattered in patterns that suggested someone had been here recently. Detective Park found several more small footprints, but these seemed different from the ones they had been following along the creek. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a child psychologist who had been called in to consult on the case, arrived with the latest group of searchers. She had worked on numerous missing child cases and understood the complex emotional factors that could affect both the children and the search teams involved. Dr. Walsh immediately noticed Rex's distressed behavior and asked Jake to describe exactly what had happened when they reached this location. Jake explained how Rex had been following the scent trail normally until they entered this section of the forest, at which point the dog's behavior had changed dramatically. The howling had been completely out of character for Rex, who was normally very focused and businesslike during search operations. Dr. Walsh suggested that Rex might be picking up on emotional distress that had occurred in this location, as dogs were known to be extremely sensitive to human emotions and psychological states. The thermal imaging helicopter reported no heat signatures in the immediate area, but the dense forest canopy made it difficult to get clear readings from above. The pilot requested that the ground teams mark their locations with flares, so the aircraft could focus its search on areas that had not yet been thoroughly examined by the search dogs. As darkness began to fall, portable lighting equipment was brought in to illuminate the search area. The harsh white glare of the LED spotlights created an eerie atmosphere in the forest, casting long shadows between the trees and making every movement seem potentially significant. Jake could hear other search teams calling Emma's name in the distance, their voices echoing through the woods as they continued their desperate efforts to find the missing girl. Rex had calmed down somewhat but remained unusually subdued as they continued searching the area. The dog seemed reluctant to move forward, often stopping and looking back at Jake with an expression of uncertainty. This behavior was so unlike Rex's normal confident approach to search, work that Jake began to wonder if his partner was trying to tell him something specific about this location. Dr. Walsh suggested that they take a break to allow Rex to decompress and refocus on his task. She explained that search dogs could sometimes become overwhelmed by intense emotional situations, particularly when they involved children in distress. The psychological pressure of a high-stakes search could affect even the most well-trained animals, causing them to behave in ways that seemed inconsistent with their normal working patterns. During the break, Jake sat with Rex under one of the massive pine trees and tried to understand what his partner was experiencing. The dog remained close to Jake's side, occasionally whimpering softly and looking toward a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards away. Jake followed Rex's gaze but could see nothing unusual about the rock formation in the artificial lighting. Detective Park received an update over her radio that Emma's mother, Sarah, had been brought to the command center that had been established at the forest entrance. Sarah was in a state of emotional collapse, barely able to speak coherently as the hours passed without any sign of her daughter. Her twin daughter Lily remained silent, still clutching her stuffed rabbit and refusing to answer questions about the night Emma had disappeared. The search teams were preparing to continue their work through the night, bringing in additional lighting and heating equipment to maintain their effectiveness in the dropping temperatures. Jake knew that hypothermia was now a critical concern for Emma, who had been missing for nearly 14 hours in nothing but thin pajamas and bare feet. The October night was becoming dangerously cold, with temperatures expected to drop below freezing before dawn. Rex suddenly stood up and walked purposefully toward the boulder cluster he had been watching. Jake followed, keeping his flashlight trained on the ground to look for any additional footprints or signs of disturbance. As they approached the rocks, Rex began whining again, but this time his behavior seemed more focused and determined rather than distressed. The boulders formed a natural shelter of sorts, with gaps between them that could provide protection from wind and weather. Jake squeezed between two of the larger rocks and found himself in a small enclosed space that was surprisingly warm and dry. His flashlight beam swept across the ground, and what he saw there made his heart skip a beat. There were clear signs that someone had recently spent time in this rocky shelter. The ground was disturbed in a pattern that suggested a small person had been lying there, and Jake could see what looked like wisps of blonde hair caught on the rough granite surface. But most importantly, there was a small pink sock lying in the corner of the shelter, exactly the type that Emma had been wearing when she disappeared from her bedroom. Jake's heart pounded as he carefully photographed the pink sock before calling Detective Park to examine the rocky shelter. Rex was now showing intense interest in the space between the boulders, his nose working overtime as he processed the complex mixture of scents that lingered in the small enclosure. The discovery of Emma's sock proved that she had been here, but it also raised new questions about where she might have gone and when she had left this temporary refuge. Detective Park arrived within minutes and immediately began documenting the scene with professional precision. The sock was carefully placed in an evidence bag, along with several strands of blonde hair that had been caught on the granite surfaces. The disturbed ground pattern suggested that Emma had spent considerable time in this shelter, possibly several hours during the coldest part of the night. Dr. Walsh joined them in examining the rock shelter and pointed out details that might provide insight into Emma's state of mind during her time there. The way the leaves and debris were arranged suggested that the 7-year-old had tried to create some kind of nest or bed for warmth and comfort. This showed remarkable survival instincts for such a young child, but it also indicated that she had been conscious and alert enough to take care of herself, at least temporarily. Rex began showing renewed energy and purpose as he worked the scent trail leading away from the boulder shelter. The dog's behavior suggested that Emma's trail continued beyond this point, giving the search teams hope that she was still alive and moving. Jake felt a mixture of relief and renewed urgency as he prepared to follow his partner deeper into the forest. The trail led them down a steep slope toward another section of the creek system that wound through the state park. Jake could hear the sound of running water growing louder as they descended, and he began to worry about the dangers that a creek might pose to a small child in the dark. The banks were steep and slippery, and the water was deep enough in some places to pose a drowning risk. As they approached the water, Rex's behavior changed again. The dog became more cautious and seemed to be processing multiple scent trails that converged near the creek bank. Jake realized that this area was probably used by wildlife coming to drink, which would create a complex mixture of smells that could confuse. Even the most experienced search dog, the helicopter pilot, radioed that thermal imaging was detecting a possible heat signature about half a mile downstream from their current location. The signature was small and stationary, consistent with a child who might be resting or sheltering in place. Jake felt a surge of hope as he and Rex began moving quickly along the creek bank toward the coordinates provided by the aircraft. Detective Park coordinated with other search teams to converge on the location, while Jake and Rex continued following the ground trail. The thermal signature was located in an area where the creek curved around a large hill, creating a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep slopes covered in dense vegetation. It was an isolated spot that would be difficult to reach in daylight, let alone in the darkness that Emma had been navigating. Rex suddenly stopped and began whining urgently. His ears perked forward as he stared across the creek toward the far bank. Jake followed his partner's gaze and thought he could see something moving in the shadows cast by the helicopter's searchlight. The movement was subtle, but it seemed too deliberate to be caused by wind or wildlife. Jake called out Emma's name across the water, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of the creek and the distant helicopter rotors. Then from somewhere in the darkness on the far side of the water came a sound that made Jake's blood run cold. It was a child's scream, high-pitched and filled with terror and desperation. The sound cut through the night air like a knife, expressing a level of fear and anguish that no 7-year-old should ever have to experience. Jake felt tears spring to his eyes as he realized that Emma was alive but in terrible distress. Rex immediately plunged into the creek, his powerful legs carrying him across the swift current toward the source of the scream. Jake followed without hesitation, the cold water shocking his system as it soaked through his uniform and equipment. The creek was deeper than it appeared, coming up to Jake's chest at the midpoint, and the current was strong enough to make crossing treacherous. The screaming continued as Jake struggled across the water, each cry seeming to tear at his heart. Emma's voice was raw and desperate, calling for her mother and sister with a heartbreak that spoke of hours of fear and loneliness. Jake could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the hoarse quality that came from crying for too long in the cold night air. Rex reached the far bank first and began barking urgently as he located the source of Emma's cries. Jake hauled himself out of the creek and followed the sound of his partner's barks through thick underbrush that seemed to grab at his clothes and equipment. His flashlight beam danced wildly as he pushed through the vegetation, desperate to reach the frightened child. He found them in a small clearing where Emma had become trapped between several large fallen trees that formed a natural cage around her. The 7-year-old was sitting on the ground, her pink pajamas torn and muddy, her blonde hair tangled with leaves and debris. She was shivering violently from cold and fear, her small body racked with sobs as she looked up at Jake with eyes that had seen too much darkness. Rex had positioned himself protectively near Emma, his calm presence seeming to provide some comfort to the terrified child. Jake slowly approached Emma, speaking in the gentlest voice he could manage while his heart broke at the sight of her condition. She was alive, but she was clearly suffering from exposure and exhaustion after spending nearly 16 hours alone in the wilderness. Emma's feet were cut and bleeding from walking barefoot over rough terrain, and Jake could see that she was showing early signs of hypothermia. Her lips were blue, and her shivering was becoming more violent as her body struggled to maintain its core temperature. Jake immediately called for medical assistance and began removing his jacket to wrap around the small girl. Detective Park's voice crackled over Jake's radio, asking for his status and location. Jake reported that Emma had been found alive but required immediate medical attention. The relief in Detective Park's voice was audible as she coordinated with the helicopter pilot to identify the best way to get medical personnel to their location as quickly as possible. Emma was too weak and frightened to walk, so Jake carefully lifted her into his arms and began carrying her toward a clearing, where the helicopter could potentially land. Rex stayed close beside them, his protective instincts fully engaged as he helped guide them through the forest toward safety. Emma continued to cry softly, calling for her mother and asking why she had been left alone in the scary woods. As they made their way toward the helicopter landing zone, Jake tried to keep Emma talking to assess her mental state and keep her conscious. He asked her simple questions about her name, her age, and her favorite things, using the techniques he had learned for dealing with traumatized children. Emma's responses were weak but coherent, suggesting that despite her physical condition, she had not suffered serious head trauma or psychological breaks. The helicopter's searchlight illuminated the small clearing as Jake emerged from the forest carrying Emma in his arms. The medical team was already preparing their equipment as the aircraft touched down, its rotors creating a whirlwind of leaves and debris that swirled around them in the night air. Emma buried her face against Jake's chest, overwhelmed by the noise and bright lights after so many hours of darkness and silence. Paramedic Maria Santos took charge of Emma's care the moment Jake reached the helicopter. Maria had 20 years of experience treating trauma victims, including many children who had been lost or injured in wilderness situations. She immediately began assessing Emma's vital signs while speaking to her in the calm, reassuring voice that had comforted countless frightened children over the years. Emma's body temperature was dangerously low, and her pulse was rapid and weak from exhaustion and dehydration. Maria quickly wrapped the little girl in thermal blankets and began administering warm intravenous fluids to help stabilize her condition. Emma's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but she seemed to understand that these new people were trying to help her, rather than hurt her. Jake stayed close to Emma during the medical assessment, recognizing that he and Rex had become sources of comfort for the traumatized child. Emma kept reaching for Jake's hand whenever the medical procedures became overwhelming, and she seemed calmer when she could see both Jake and Rex nearby. The bond that had formed during those terrifying moments in the forest was something that would connect them forever. Dr. Walsh arrived at the landing zone and immediately began working with Emma to assess her psychological state. The child psychologist was skilled at communicating with traumatized children and quickly established a rapport with Emma that allowed her to begin gathering crucial information about what had happened during the 16 hours she was missing. Emma's account of her ordeal was heartbreaking in its simplicity. She explained that she had woken up in the middle of the night because she heard someone calling her name from outside her bedroom window. Thinking it might be her mother or sister, Emma had climbed out of bed and looked out into the backyard. She saw a figure in the shadows near the edge of the forest who seemed to be beckoning for her to come outside. The 7-year-old had quietly left her bedroom and walked out the back door, following the mysterious figure into the woods. She quickly became lost in the darkness and could no longer see whoever had been calling to her. Emma had wandered through the forest for hours, becoming increasingly frightened and disoriented as she tried to find her way home. Dr. Walsh listened carefully to Emma's story, taking notes and asking gentle follow-up questions to clarify details without causing additional trauma. The psychologist was particularly interested in Emma's description of the figure who had lured her into the forest. Emma could not provide many specific details, saying only that it had been too dark to see clearly and that the person had disappeared once she entered the woods. Detective Park received updates on Emma's condition over her radio and began coordinating the investigation into how a 7-year-old child had been able to leave her house in the middle of the night without being detected. The back door of the Coleman house had been found unlocked that morning, but Sarah was certain she had locked it before going to bed. This suggested that someone might have unlocked it from the inside, but Emma was the only person who could have done so. The helicopter lifted off with Emma, Jake, and the medical team aboard, heading for Children's Hospital where specialists were standing by to provide comprehensive treatment for hypothermia, dehydration, and potential trauma-related injuries. Rex remained on the ground with Detective Park and the other searchers, his job complete now that Emma had been found alive. During the flight to the hospital, Emma began to open up more about her experience in the forest. She described finding the rocky shelter where she had spent several hours trying to stay warm, and how she had lost one of her socks when she had to climb over fallen logs and rocks. The little girl had shown remarkable resilience and survival instincts, managing to find shelter and conserve her body heat during the coldest hours of the night. Emma also talked about the animals she had encountered during her ordeal, including deer, raccoons, and what she described as a large bird that had watched her from the trees. She seemed to have developed a strange connection with the forest creatures, describing how they had not seemed afraid of her, and had sometimes come quite close to where she was hiding. Most disturbing to the adults. Listening was Emma's description of voices she claimed to have heard throughout the night. She said that someone had been calling her name repeatedly, always seeming to come from just beyond her sight in the darkness. These voices had kept her moving through the forest when she might otherwise have stayed in the rocky shelter, driving her deeper into the wilderness as she tried to find their source. Dr. Walsh noted that auditory hallucinations were not uncommon in children experiencing severe stress and hypothermia, but Emma's accounts were remarkably consistent and detailed for someone in her condition. The psychologist made careful notes about these reported voices, understanding that they might be crucial to understanding what had really happened that night. The hospital emergency room was ready for Emma's arrival, with pediatric specialists, trauma counselors, and social workers all standing by to provide comprehensive care. Dr. Michael Chen, the chief of pediatric emergency medicine, took personal charge of Emma's case as she was wheeled into the treatment bay on a gurney that seemed far too large for her small body. Sarah Coleman was waiting in the hospital when the helicopter arrived, having been brought there by police officers who had been keeping her updated throughout the search. The reunion between mother and daughter was emotional beyond words, with Sarah sobbing as she held Emma close and whispered promises that she would never let her out of her sight again. Lily, Emma's twin sister, had also been brought to the hospital and remained silent as she watched the medical team work on her sister. The 7-year-old clutched her stuffed rabbit and stood close to her mother, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. Dr. Walsh noted that Lily's continued silence was concerning and suggested that she might also need psychological evaluation and support. Jake remained at the hospital throughout the night, unable to leave until he was certain that Emma was stable and safe. He found himself deeply affected by the case in ways that surprised him, feeling a protective connection to the little girl that went beyond his professional duties. Rex had been allowed into the hospital as a therapy animal, and the German Shepherd stayed close to Emma's bedside, providing comfort through his calm presence. As the hours passed and Emma's condition stabilized, Jake began to process the strange elements of the case that didn't quite fit together. The unlocked door, the mysterious figure that had called Emma into the forest, and most puzzling of all, Lily's complete silence about what had happened that night. Something about the twin sisters' behavior troubled Jake, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was bothering him. Dr. Walsh spent considerable time observing the interaction between the twin sisters when they were finally reunited in Emma's hospital room. Lily approached her sister's bed hesitantly, still clutching her stuffed rabbit and maintaining the silence that had characterized her behavior since Emma's disappearance was discovered. When Emma reached out to touch her sister's hand, Lily pulled back slightly, her eyes filled with an emotion that Dr. Walsh couldn't immediately identify. Emma seemed genuinely happy to see her twin sister, chattering weakly about her adventure in the forest and asking Lily if she had been worried. But Lily's responses were limited to nods and head shakes, her voice seemingly frozen by whatever trauma she had experienced during Emma's absence. Dr. Walsh made a note to schedule individual sessions with both girls to better understand their psychological states. The medical tests showed that Emma was suffering from moderate hypothermia, dehydration, and numerous cuts and bruises from her journey through the forest. Her feet were badly lacerated from walking barefoot over rough terrain, and she would need several weeks to fully recover from her physical injuries. However, Dr. Chen was optimistic that there would be no lasting physical damage from her ordeal. Detective Park arrived at the hospital in the early morning hours with preliminary results from the investigation into how Emma had been able to leave the house undetected. The back door lock showed no signs of tampering, and there were no fingerprints other than those of the Coleman family members. Security cameras from neighboring houses had not captured any unusual activity around the Coleman property during the night. Sarah Coleman remained by Emma's bedside, holding her daughter's hand and fighting back tears as she listened to the little girl's account of her time in the forest. The single mother was overwhelmed with guilt, wondering how she could have failed to notice that Emma was missing for so many hours. She kept apologizing to Emma, promising that nothing like this would ever happen again. Jake found himself drawn back to the puzzle of Lily's silence and her strange behavior around her twin sister. During his years of police work, he had learned to trust his instincts when something didn't feel right about a situation. There was something... 3 days after Emma's rescue, Jake returned to the hospital for what he thought would be a routine follow-up visit. He wanted to check on Emma's recovery and perhaps get some closure on a case that had affected him more deeply than any other in his career. Rex accompanied him, eager to see the little girl who had captured both their hearts during those terrifying hours in the forest. Emma was sitting up in her hospital bed, looking much healthier than when they had found her trapped between the fallen logs. Her blonde hair had been washed and braided, and the color had returned to her cheeks. She smiled brightly when she saw Jake and Rex enter her room, immediately reaching out to pet the German Shepherd who had played such a crucial role in her rescue. Dr. Walsh was also in the room, conducting what appeared to be a therapy session with both Emma and Lily. The child psychologist had been working with the twins individually and together, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened that night and how it had affected both girls. Lily was still largely silent, but she seemed more comfortable around her sister than she had been immediately after the rescue. Jake noticed that Lily kept glancing at him nervously, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. Dr. Walsh had mentioned that the silent twin was slowly beginning to open up in their private sessions, but that she seemed to be struggling with feelings of guilt and responsibility related to Emma's disappearance. Emma was happily recounting her adventure to Jake, describing the animals she had seen in the rocky shelter where she had tried to stay warm. Her resilience was remarkable for such a young child, and she seemed to view her ordeal as something between a scary dream and an exciting adventure. Now that she was safe and surrounded by people who cared about her, Dr. Walsh asked Jake if she could speak with him privately. In the hallway outside Emma's room, the psychologist had a serious expression that immediately put Jake on alert, suggesting that she had discovered something important during her sessions with the girls. They stepped outside, leaving Rex to continue providing comfort to the twins. Dr. Walsh explained that her individual sessions with Lily had revealed some disturbing information about what had really happened the night Emma disappeared. Lily had finally begun talking during their most recent session, and her account of events was significantly different from what everyone had assumed. The silent twin had been carrying a terrible burden of guilt that was affecting her ability to speak or interact normally with others. According to Dr. Walsh, Lily had admitted that she had been awake when Emma left their bedroom that night. In fact, Lily had been the one who had called Emma's name from outside the window, pretending to be their mother's voice to get her sister's attention. The 7-year-old had been angry with Emma about something that had happened earlier that day and had wanted to play a trick on her twin sister. Lily had unlocked the back door and gone outside, where she had called for Emma to come out and play a midnight game of hide-and-seek. The plan had been to hide from Emma for a few minutes and then reveal herself, laughing at the joke she had played. But when Emma had come outside and started walking toward the forest, Lily had become frightened by how dark and scary everything looked. The little girl had called out to Emma to stop and come back, but her sister had already disappeared into the woods. Lily had been too scared to follow Emma into the dark forest and too ashamed to wake up their mother and admit what she had done. Instead, she had gone back inside and pretended to be asleep, hoping that Emma would find her way back on her own. Jake felt a mixture of shock and sadness as Dr. Walsh explained Lily's confession. The silent twin had spent 3 days believing that her sister's terrifying ordeal was entirely her fault, carrying a burden of guilt that no 7-year-old should have to bear. Her silence had been a form of self-punishment, a way of withdrawing from the world, because she felt she didn't deserve to be happy when Emma was suffering because of her actions. Dr. Walsh emphasized that Lily's behavior was completely normal for a child her age who was dealing with overwhelming guilt and trauma. The psychologist had been working with Lily to help her understand that while her actions had contributed to the situation, she was not responsible for everything that had happened afterward. The important thing now was helping both girls process the experience in a healthy way. Jake asked if the parents and investigators needed to be informed about Lily's confession, understanding that this new information might change how the case was officially classified. Dr. Walsh explained that she had already spoken with Sarah Coleman about Lily's revelation, and that the mother was struggling with her own complex emotions about what her daughter had done. Sarah was relieved to finally understand why Lily had been so silent and withdrawn, but she was also grappling with anger and disappointment that her daughter had kept such an important secret. The single mother was trying to balance her need to discipline Lily for her dangerous prank with her recognition that the little girl was already punishing herself more than any adult consequence could accomplish. Detective Park would also need to be briefed on the new information, as it would officially close the investigation into Emma's disappearance. There had been no stranger danger or criminal activity involved, just a children's prank that had gone terribly wrong. The case would be reclassified as an accidental disappearance rather than a potential abduction or endangerment situation. Jake returned to Emma's room feeling emotionally drained by the revelation about Lily's role in the incident. He looked at the 2 little girls with new understanding, seeing them not just as victim and witness, but as 2 children who had both been traumatized by a series of events that had spiraled far beyond anything they could have anticipated or controlled. Emma was still chattering happily about her forest adventure, blissfully unaware that her sister had been carrying such a heavy burden of guilt. Lily sat quietly in her chair, occasionally glancing at Jake as if trying to gauge whether he was angry with her now that he knew the truth about what had happened. Jake knelt down beside Lily's chair and spoke to her, in the same gentle voice he had used with Emma during the rescue. He told the little girl that he understood she had made a mistake, but that everyone made mistakes sometimes and the important thing was learning from them. He explained that her sister was safe now, and that was what mattered most. For the first time since the incident, Lily spoke directly to Jake, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked if Emma would still love her when she found out what she had done. Jake assured her that sisters always loved each other, even when they made mistakes or had arguments. He explained that the most important thing now was being honest with each other and working together to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Rex seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation and moved to sit between the two girls, allowing both of them to pet him and draw comfort from his calm presence. The German Shepherd had an intuitive understanding of human emotions that made him an excellent therapy animal in situations like this. Dr. Walsh rejoined them in the room and announced that she thought it would be beneficial for Lily to tell Emma the truth about what had happened that night. The psychologist believed that both girls needed to process the experience together in order to move forward and heal from the trauma they had shared. The conversation between the twin sisters took place the following afternoon in the hospital's family therapy room, a comfortable space designed to help children and families work through difficult situations. Dr. Walsh had prepared both girls for this moment, but everyone was nervous about how Emma would react when she learned the truth about her sister's role in her terrifying ordeal. Jake and Rex were invited to be present during the conversation, as both girls had formed strong bonds with the officer and his partner during the rescue. Sarah Coleman sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched her daughters prepare to confront the truth about what had really happened that night. Lily had been practicing what she wanted to say with Dr. Walsh, but when the moment came, the words tumbled out in a rush of tears and apologies. She told Emma about being angry over their earlier argument about sharing toys, about pretending to be their mother's voice calling from outside, and about being too scared to follow Emma into the dark forest when her prank went wrong. Emma listened quietly, her 7-year-old mind trying to process the complex emotions and motivations behind her sister's actions. At first she seemed confused, asking why Lily would want to trick her into going outside in the scary dark. But as Lily continued to explain through her tears, Emma began to understand that her sister had not meant for anything bad to happen. The moment that Jake would remember for the rest of his life came when Emma reached out and took Lily's hand, telling her twin that she forgave her and that she was glad they were both safe now. The simple wisdom and compassion of the 7-year-old's response brought tears to the eyes of every adult in the room, demonstrating a capacity for forgiveness that many grown-ups struggled to achieve. Lily's relief was immediate and overwhelming. The burden of guilt that had kept her silent for days seemed to lift from her small shoulders as she hugged her sister and promised never to play such a dangerous trick again. The twins held each other close, their bond strengthened rather than damaged by the truth they had shared. Dr. Walsh guided the family through a discussion about safety, rules, and the importance of always telling adults when something scary or dangerous happened. Sarah established new bedtime routines and security measures that would help both girls feel safer while ensuring that nothing like this could happen again in the future. The psychological evaluation revealed that both girls would benefit from ongoing counseling to help them process the trauma and develop healthy coping strategies. Emma needed support in dealing with her memories of being lost and alone in the forest, while Lily required help in managing her guilt and learning to make better choices when she felt angry or frustrated. Jake found himself becoming a regular visitor to the Coleman household. In the weeks following Emma's rescue, he and Rex had become extended family members of sorts, invited to birthday parties and school events as the girls recovered from their shared ordeal. The officer discovered that helping the family heal had become as important to him as any other aspect of his police work. 6 months later, Jake attended the twins' 8th birthday party, where Emma proudly showed off the survival skills she had learned during wilderness safety classes that Sarah had enrolled her in after the incident. Lily had become one of the most safety-conscious children in her class, always making sure that her friends' parents knew where they were and when they would be home. The case had a profound impact on Jake's approach to police work, teaching him that sometimes the most important part of an investigation was not just solving the mystery, but helping people heal from the trauma they had experienced. He began volunteering with the department's Victim Services Unit, using his experience with the Coleman family to help other families navigate difficult situations. Rex continued to work as Jake's partner, but he also began participating in the police department's therapy dog program, visiting hospitals and schools to provide comfort to children who had experienced trauma. The German Shepherd seemed to have an intuitive understanding of when children needed his special kind of support, just as he had demonstrated during Emma's rescue and recovery. The rocky shelter where Emma had spent several hours during her ordeal became something of a local landmark, with park rangers installing a small plaque commemorating her survival skills and the successful search and rescue operation. School groups would sometimes visit the site during nature education programs, learning about wilderness safety and the importance of staying calm during emergencies. Dr. Walsh continued to work with families affected by trauma, often sharing the Coleman twins' story as an example of how children could overcome even the most frightening experiences when they had proper support and understanding. The psychologist emphasized that both girls had shown remarkable resilience, but that their recovery had been possible because the adults in their lives had responded with compassion rather than judgment. Sarah Coleman became an advocate for missing child awareness and search and rescue funding in her community, working with local law enforcement to improve response protocols and equipment. She never forgot the terror of those 16 hours when she didn't know if she would ever see Emma again, and she wanted to help other families avoid or better cope with similar situations. The story of Emma's rescue and the family's healing became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and love could prevail. Jake often reflected on how a routine missing child call had taught him so much about courage, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds between family members who truly cared for each other. Years later, when Jake would tell the story to new officers or community groups, he always emphasized that the most important discovery that night had not been finding Emma alive in the forest. It had been witnessing the power of a 7-year-old's forgiveness and watching a family choose love and understanding over blame and anger in the face of their worst fears coming true. The heartbreaking scream that had led Jake and Rex to Emma that night had been transformed into something else entirely, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening experiences can become the foundation for deeper understanding, stronger relationships, and more profound appreciation for the precious gift of family. Emma and Lily Coleman had survived their ordeal not just physically, but emotionally, growing stronger and closer through an experience that could have torn them apart forever.